Days before 6 people were found dead on a German farm, its owner reportedly discovered footprints leading from the forest toward his buildings. He could not find a clear trail leading away. Then a house key disappeared, and noises were heard above the rooms. The farm was Hinterkaifeck, and someone might already have been inside. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck. On maps, it was little more than a lonely collection of buildings in the Bavarian countryside, roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich. On the night of March 31, 1922, every person living there was killed. More than a century later, no one has ever been convicted. And the most disturbing possibility is not simply that the murderer escaped. It is that the killer may have remained at the farm after everyone was dead. Hinterkaifeck stood beyond the small hamlet of Kaifeck, separated from its neighbors by fields, patches of woodland, and unpaved tracks. The residence, stable, barn, machine room, and sheds were connected in a single irregular complex. A person familiar with the property could move from one section to another without stepping into the open. The farm belonged to 63-year-old Andreas Gruber and his 72-year-old wife, Kazilia. Their widowed daughter, 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel, lived with them. Victoria had 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph. They worked the land, kept livestock, attended church, and were known in the surrounding villages. But the family was also isolated by bitter disputes and private scandals. Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, had been killed during the First World War. Authorities later confirmed his burial in France, despite rumors that he had secretly returned. In 1915, Andreas and Victoria had been convicted of an incestuous relationship. Years later, the paternity of young Joseph became another source of conflict. A neighboring farmer named Lorenz Schlittenbauer had been involved with Victoria and had at one point acknowledged the child, but arguments over money and paternity damaged the relationship between the two households. Those facts would later dominate the investigation. But before the murders, something else was troubling Andreas Gruber. Accounts preserved in the case material describe a series of strange incidents during the final days of March. Andreas reportedly told neighbors about footprints crossing fresh snow toward the farm. The exact number of prints and the precise route changed in later recollections, so they must be treated carefully. What remains consistent is that Andreas believed someone had approached the property during the night and may have entered one of the outbuildings. He also complained that a house key had vanished. A Munich newspaper appeared on the property even though no one at Hinterkaifeck was known to subscribe to it. There were later stories of footsteps in the attic and a door that would not remain closed. Some versions may have grown in the retelling, but the missing key and suspected nighttime intrusion appear in police-era records. The family's previous maid had left months earlier. According to later reports, she said the farm was haunted because she heard sounds from above. On Friday, March 31st, a new maid arrived. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old, and because of a physical disability, her sister accompanied her to the farm. Maria had barely settled into her room before darkness fell. Investigators believe the killings began that evening. 4 members of the family were found in the barn: Andreas, his wife Kazilia, Victoria, and 7-year-old Kazilia. The arrangement of the scene suggested that they may have entered the barn separately, perhaps responding to a noise or following someone they trusted. That sequence, however, was a reconstruction, not something police could prove. 2-year-old Joseph was found inside the residence. Maria Baumgartner was found in the room assigned to her. All 6 victims had been attacked with a heavy farm implement. This story does not require graphic details. What matters is that the weapon, the location, and the apparent control of the property suggested a killer who understood the layout and knew how to move quietly between the connected buildings. Then Hinterkaifeck went silent. On Saturday, young Kazilia did not arrive at school. No one from the family appeared at church on Sunday. Mail began accumulating. People passing the farm noticed that the dog and livestock were still there, yet no family member came outside. Smoke may have been seen near the property, although the famous story about the bread oven is less certain than it is often presented. What is better supported is that the animals survived during the days between the murders and the discovery. Investigators and later witnesses believed the cattle had been fed. Food had apparently been used inside the house. If that interpretation is correct, the murderer did not flee immediately. Someone returned to the stable, moved through the same rooms, and carried out ordinary farm chores while 6 victims remained undiscovered only meters away. On Tuesday, April 4th, a mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrived to repair an engine. He called out but received no answer. He worked at the farm for several hours, hearing the animals inside but seeing no residents. When the repair was complete, he left word with people in the nearby village. Concern finally became action. Lorenz Schlittenbauer went to Hinterkaifeck with 2 other farmers, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel. They entered through the machine house and moved into the barn. There they found the first 4 victims. Schlittenbauer then separated from the others and entered the living quarters, where the remaining 2 were discovered. By modern standards, the crime scene was damaged almost immediately. Neighbors entered the buildings. The bodies in the barn were moved before investigators arrived. People walked through rooms, handled objects, prepared food, and remained at the farm overnight. The Munich Murder Commission did not reach the area until early the following morning. Whatever footprints, fingerprints, fibers, or small traces the killer left behind were mixed with evidence from the people who came after. The delay was not simply incompetence. Hinterkaifeck was remote, telephone access was limited, and investigators traveled from Munich during the night. For 1922, the Murder Commission attempted a serious inquiry. Officers photographed parts of the scene, interviewed residents, followed financial records, and asked medical examiners to compare the injuries. But modern crime scene control did not exist. There was no DNA testing, no national digital database, and no reliable way to separate the killer's touch from that of a curious neighbor. Even the farm's architecture worked against them. The barn connected to the stable, which connected to the residence. Doors, passages, loft spaces, and stored hay created many places to wait or hide. A stranger could have studied the property. A former worker would already know it. A neighbor could approach without attracting attention. Every theory seemed possible because the scene offered too many routes and too few preserved traces. The investigation still produced important clues. Money and valuables remained in the house, making a simple robbery difficult to explain. The family dog was alive. The livestock had not been abandoned. There were signs that someone may have slept in the hay above the stable. And the weapon was missing. The apparent activity after the murders created 3 possibilities. The first was that the killer stayed continuously, sleeping in the buildings and eating the family's food. The second was that someone living nearby returned briefly to care for the animals and prevent their noise from raising an alarm. The third was that witnesses misunderstood when the livestock had last been fed, turning an uncertain detail into a darker story. The records support continued care of the animals, but they cannot tell us exactly who provided it or for how long. Police questioned traveling workers, former farmhands, thieves, neighbors, relatives, and men recently released from prison. They circulated descriptions and followed claims across Germany. More than 100 people would eventually attract attention. But the case suffered from conflicting statements, lost documents, rumors repeated as testimony, and the absence of reliable forensic evidence. The strongest public suspicion fell on Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He knew the buildings. He had a complicated relationship with Victoria. He had argued over Joseph's paternity and financial support. Witnesses considered his behavior during the discovery unusual because he entered the house alone and appeared comfortable moving through it. The missing key made his actions seem even more suspicious. One account claimed he opened the front door from inside. Schlittenbauer said the key was already in the lock. Later police reviews noted that he had first entered through the barn and machine room route with the other men, not through the locked front door. That detail weakened one of the most repeated accusations. Schlittenbauer was questioned repeatedly, and investigators took the allegations seriously. Yet they could not establish that he possessed the missing key, place him at the farm during the killings, or connect him to the weapon. Years of village gossip produced dramatic stories, but no physical evidence. He denied involvement and pursued legal action when people publicly called him the Hinterkaifeck murderer. Suspicion is not proof, and he was never charged. Another theory claimed Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had survived the war and returned for revenge. Police checked military records and contacted men who had served with him. His death and burial in France were confirmed. The ghost soldier made for an eerie story, but the evidence placed him in a grave 8 years before the murders. Other names entered the file. The Gump brothers were linked through later accusations, including a claim reportedly made within their own family. Former soldiers and political extremists were considered. Investigators explored whether hidden weapons, black market activity, inheritance, revenge, or a violent family dispute could explain the attack. None of those paths produced a case that could survive in court. A robbery theory remained tempting because the years after the First World War were unstable. Travelers crossed the countryside looking for work and food. Farms were targets for theft, and isolated families sometimes kept cash at home. Yet an ordinary robber had little reason to remain, feed cattle, hide the weapon on the property, and leave obvious valuables behind. If theft was the original plan, something had gone catastrophically beyond it. A personal motive fit the scene more easily, but it produced a different problem. Many people knew the family's conflicts. Knowledge of a quarrel did not identify a murderer. Later witnesses repeated things they had heard in taverns years earlier. Each retelling made the speaker sound more certain. Police had to distinguish memory from rumor, and rumor from deliberate accusation. By the 1930s, the legend of Hinterkaifeck was already contaminating testimony just as surely as visitors had contaminated the physical scene. The murder weapon finally appeared in February 1923, when Hinterkaifeck was being demolished. Workers found a blood-stained mattock concealed beneath boards in the attic area. Its unusual construction corresponded with the injuries described by the medical examiners. The tool had belonged to the farm. Finding it so late had enormous consequences. For almost a year, investigators could not test a suspect's account against the actual weapon. By the time it emerged, the farmhouse had been searched, occupied by guards, visited by officials, and prepared for demolition. Its location was suggestive, especially beside stories about the attic, but it could no longer reveal when it had been hidden or whether anyone had moved it after the crime. That discovery deepened the central mystery. If the killer had taken the weapon from Hinterkaifeck and hidden it inside the building, was the attacker a stranger who improvised? Or was it someone who knew exactly where the tool was stored and where it could be concealed? And if someone had been hiding above the family before the murders, had the weapon been prepared in advance? The farmhouse was gone. The victims had been buried. Important objects disappeared, and even the victims' skulls, retained for examination, were later lost during the upheaval of the Second World War. Investigators reopened old leads during the following decades, but each passing year removed witnesses and weakened memories. In 2007, students at a Bavarian police academy reviewed the surviving material using modern investigative methods. Reports say they independently converged on a principal suspect, but the name was not publicly released, partly out of respect for living relatives and partly because the remaining evidence could not support a legal conclusion. It was an academic review, not a solved prosecution. Today, the paranormal language surrounding Hinterkaifeck can distract from what makes the case truly frightening. There is no evidence of ghosts or a curse. There are only human actions, a missing key, a suspected intrusion, 6 victims, an isolated farm, and a killer who understood that no one would come quickly. Perhaps the sounds above the rooms were an animal, old timber, or a story enlarged after the tragedy. Perhaps someone really was watching the family from the attic. Perhaps the footprints belonged to the murderer, or perhaps they had an innocent explanation. The surviving records cannot settle every detail. But one question remains harder to dismiss. During the days when Hinterkaifeck should have been empty, the animals did not die of neglect. People near the property saw signs of activity. A mechanic worked outside for hours while no resident appeared. Whoever committed the murders may have been close enough to hear him. More than a century later, Hinterkaifeck remains unsolved. The farm no longer stands, and the fields have reclaimed the place where it once stood. There is no final confession, no preserved DNA profile, and no verdict. Only a trail leading toward a silent house and the possibility that, before anyone understood the danger, the killer was already inside.